The vote was unanimous. Every single seat in the Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council cast the same result. Humanity was to be outlawed. Not warned. Not fined. Not placed on a watch list. Outlawed. The word echoed through the great crystalline hall of Varanthus Prime like a death sentence carved into the bones of the universe. Ambassador Kethala of the Siruan pressed his 6 fingers together and exhaled slowly. He had expected resistance from a few member worlds. He had not expected silence. Even the Dravani, who had traded peacefully with humans for 40 years, said nothing. They simply looked down at their voting consoles and pressed the red sigil. Done. Final. Clean. The reason, officially, was escalation. Humanity had been expanding at a rate that made every species in the known galaxy deeply uncomfortable. In less than 300 years, they had gone from a single blue planet to over 400 colonized worlds, 11 deep space stations, and 2 artificial star systems built entirely from materials they had mined from dead solar bodies. They had not asked permission. They had not filed requests with the Council. They simply went, built, and stayed. When asked to slow down, they smiled and nodded, and then launched 6 more colony ships the following week. The Council called it aggression. Humanity called it Tuesday. But there were deeper reasons. Reasons that most species did not want to say out loud. Humans were unpredictable. They made alliances based on emotion rather than logic. They changed their minds. They had started wars over small pieces of land, and then, somehow, ended those wars and traded with the same enemy a generation later. They created art that made other species feel things they did not understand. They formed friendships with species that were supposed to be beneath social consideration. And worst of all, they were funny. Not in the way a jester was funny, performing a safe and predictable routine. They were funny in a way that confused everyone around them. They made jokes at funerals. They laughed when they were afraid. No species in the galaxy did that. It was deeply, profoundly unsettling. The official decree was broadcast across every communication channel in Council-controlled space. Human vessels were to be denied docking rights at all Council-affiliated ports. Human colonies outside of the Sol system were to be cut off from trade agreements, medical supply chains, and interstellar communication networks controlled by Council infrastructure. Human citizens found in Council territory would be detained and returned. Any species caught actively trading with or assisting humanity would face sanctions. It was thorough. It was severe. It was, the Council believed, the cleanest way to quietly suffocate a species that had grown far too loud. On the human colony of New Carthage, a woman named Director Elena Vasquez received the news while eating breakfast. She read the full decree twice. Then she put down her fork, drank the rest of her coffee, and said to her aide, "Get me Admiral Torres and the colonial governors. Conference in 1 hour." Her aide asked if she was worried. She said no. She said they had been half expecting this for 15 years, and that the Council had just made the single biggest mistake in its 4,000-year history. She said it calmly, which made it worse somehow. Her aide went home that night and could not sleep. Across the 412 human colonies, the reaction was not panic. There was no rioting in the streets, no desperate broadcasts pleading with the Council to reconsider. Instead, there were meetings. Long, serious meetings between engineers and logistics specialists and agricultural scientists and military commanders. Supply chains were mapped. Redundancies were identified. Every resource humanity had access to was cataloged and assessed. The question was not, what do we do now? The question was, how long do we have, and what can we build before anyone notices? The Council had assumed that cutting off humanity from the broader galactic economy would cause collapse within a decade. What they had failed to account for was that humans had been quietly preparing for exactly this kind of scenario for over 30 years. Not because they were paranoid, but because after enough history, they had learned that when things were going well, it was a good time to prepare for when they were not. Every major human colony had food production systems capable of feeding its population independently. Every deep space station had fuel synthesis technology that required no external supply. The humans had not been reckless. They had been building, quietly and steadily, a civilization that needed no one else to survive. What the Council also did not know was that not all alien species agreed with the vote. 3 junior Council members had abstained rather than voted yes, which technically counted as agreement under Council law, but which carried a different meaning to those who had cast it. And beyond the council chamber, out in the edges of known space where the council's reach was thin, there were species that had never been offered a seat at the table. Species that had watched humanity for decades with something that was not fear, something closer to recognition. They had been outlawed too, once, or ignored, or told they were too small, too strange, too difficult to govern. They remembered what that felt like. They had been watching the humans for a long time. The first sign that the council had miscalculated came 6 weeks after the decree. A small cargo freighter registered to a species called the Myrith, a quiet, insectoid people from the outer edge of the Cauldron Nebula who had never been significant enough for the council to pay much attention to, docked at the human station Helix 7 with a full hold of rare chemical compounds used in advanced medical synthesis. The ship's captain, a creature with 12 legs and eyes that reflected light in 7 colors, handed over the cargo manifest and said, in perfect human standard, "We heard you might need some help." Then she added, in a quieter voice, "We've been waiting for an excuse to stop pretending we like the council." The station director of Helix 7 stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was the kind of laugh that came from somewhere deep and surprised and real. The Myrith captain did not fully understand it, but she had been told that when humans laughed like that, it was a good sign. She decided to believe it. Her crew unloaded the cargo in 3 hours. By the time they were done, 2 more ships from 2 different unaffiliated species were requesting docking clearance. Word had traveled fast out in the edges of space. The Galactic Council had made its move, and the part of the galaxy that the Council had never bothered to take seriously was paying very close attention. Back on Varanthus Prime, Ambassador Kethala reviewed the initial reports from the first 6 weeks post-decree. Trade disruptions were minor. Human vessels had ceased appearing at major ports. The silence from humanity was exactly what they had hoped for. One of his advisors called it dignified compliance. Kethala was not entirely convinced. He had studied humans for 20 years. He had read their history, their literature, their military records. He had noted, with particular interest, that across every period of human history, whenever humans had gone quiet, truly quiet, without protest or noise or drama, it meant they were not giving up. It meant they were building something. He filed a private report to the Council's Intelligence Division, marked urgent, recommending increased surveillance of human space. The report was received. It was placed in a queue. It was not acted upon for another 3 months. By then, it would already be too late to act on it in the way Kethala had intended. Not because humanity had become dangerous in the way the Council feared, but because the shape of the galaxy was already beginning to change, quietly and completely, in a direction that no one on the Council had thought to look. 3 months after the decree, a Galactic Council surveillance drone designated Watcher 9 completed its scheduled scan of the outer rim sector known as the Cauldron Fringe and transmitted its findings back to Varanthus Prime. The analysts who processed the report initially thought the drone had malfunctioned. The data was rerun twice. Then a senior analyst named Preth of the Siruan was called in, and she looked at the numbers for a long time without speaking. What the drone had found was not a few scattered ships meeting quietly in the dark. It was infrastructure. 17 new trade relay stations had been constructed along routes that carefully skirted every major council-controlled corridor. Not illegal routes, because the council's jurisdiction did not formally extend to the fringe. Just new ones. Efficient ones. Routes that connected outer rim species to each other and, at the center of every single network map, to humanity. Preth wrote her report carefully. She chose words that were precise and flat, because the words she actually wanted to use would have alarmed people more than the situation currently warranted. What she wrote was, "Humanity appears to be constructing an alternative trade network in unregulated space, utilizing relationships with non-council species as primary infrastructure partners." What she meant was, they are building their own galaxy. She submitted the report. Ambassador Kethala read it within the hour. He sat very still for a while. Then he asked for every piece of intelligence on the species involved in the new network: the Myrith, the Talindi, the Krev, the Earthy Collective, the dozen moons of Pel. And what he found, going through file after file, was that they were all species the Council had consistently underestimated. Small traders, fringe dwellers, species without military power or significant political weight. species that the Council had never bothered to cultivate or threaten because they had never seemed worth the effort. Humanity had apparently thought otherwise. The records showed trade agreements going back 20 years between human companies and Myrith mining operations, cultural exchange programs between human universities and Telendi scholars, medical assistance provided by human doctors to Krev settlements during an outbreak that the Council had declined to address. It was not politics. It was something the Council struggled to classify. It looked like friendship, genuine and long-tended, built without any obvious strategic intent. That was perhaps the most baffling part. Every major galactic power built alliances the same way, through leverage, through mutual threat reduction, through the slow mathematics of mutual benefit. Humans built them by showing up, helping out, and remembering names. Director Vasquez, operating now from the mobile command station Resilience anchored near the edge of the fringe, received daily updates on the network's growth and described each new development to her team with the same low-key satisfaction of a gardener watching plants come in season. She did not call it a trade network in internal communications. She called it the neighborhood. When Admiral Torres reviewed the name, he asked if that was really the official designation. She said it was, and that she liked it, because it made clear what kind of structure they were building. Not an empire. Not an alliance forged in threat. A neighborhood. Places where people knew each other and looked out for each other and occasionally borrowed things they needed. Torres had been a military man his entire career and had spent 40 years thinking in terms of force projection and deterrence. He looked at the map of the neighborhood for a long time, at all its small connected nodes spreading through the fringe like roots through soil, and thought that it might be the most quietly dangerous thing he had ever seen. The Council's second major miscalculation became visible in the 5th month when they attempted to enforce the trade embargo on the Telendi. The Telendi were a mild-mannered species of roughly bird-like appearance who operated a small but reliable shipping fleet in the mid-fringe region. They had no military capability worth noting. Sanctioning them was supposed to be simple. Restrict their access to Council ports, freeze their accounts in Council banking systems, and within a few months they would be forced back into compliance. What happened instead was that within 2 weeks of the sanctions being announced, every Telendi debt held within Council financial networks was quietly paid off, in full, in currency that traced back, through 6 layers of transaction, to human colonial funds. The Telendi had no more leverage points for the Council to press. They were, financially speaking, free, and they knew it. Their Council liaison reported that when he attempted to explain the consequences of continued noncompliance, the Telendi trade minister had listened politely and then told him, in perfectly respectful diplomatic language, that she was afraid his concerns were no longer relevant to her situation. The Council began to understand that they had a problem, but they were not yet ready to call it what it was. In their internal discussions, they referred to it as the containment challenge and approached it as a logistics problem. How to close the gaps in their enforcement network, how to increase pressure on fringe species, how to make the cost of associating with humanity higher than the benefit. What they were not discussing, because it had not yet occurred to most of them as a serious possibility, was that the shape of galactic power itself might be shifting, slowly and quietly, in the places they had never bothered to watch. On the human colony of Port Saline, a 14-year-old girl named Amara watched her mother, an orbital engineer, supervise the construction of a new deep space relay tower through the colony's observation window. Amara asked her mother why they were building so many new stations when the Council had told them to stop. Her mother thought about it for a moment and said that when someone tells you that you are not allowed to talk to your friends, the best answer is not to stop talking to your friends. It is to build better ways to talk to them. Amara thought about this and then asked what happened if the person who said stop was very powerful. Her mother said that power was complicated and that the Council was powerful in the ways they had always been powerful, but that those ways relied on other people believing they were the only option. The moment people had another option, the power changed shape. Amara nodded slowly. Then she asked if they were winning. Her mother smiled and said they hadn't started yet. What Amara's mother did not say, because she did not want to put it in those terms for a 14-year-old, was that what humanity was doing was not winning or losing in any traditional sense. They were rendering the game irrelevant. Every station built in unregulated space was a station the Council had no authority over. Every trade deal signed between human merchants and fringe species was a deal that did not pass through council-controlled financial systems. Every medical supply, every shared technology, every cultural exchange that happened in the neighborhood was happening entirely outside the structure the council had spent 4,000 years building and protecting. The council could not sanction what it could not reach. And humanity, with the patience and persistence that had always made it uniquely dangerous, was moving further and further beyond reach every single day. By the 6th month, 3 more species had quietly declined to renew their council membership fees. Not resigned, just declined to pay, which under council law placed them in a category of passive non-membership that carried no penalties but offered no protections. To outsiders, it looked like a bureaucratic technicality. To anyone paying close attention, it looked like a door swinging open. Ambassador Kethala filed 6 more urgent reports. He was told by the council's executive chamber that the situation was being monitored and that humanity's isolation was proceeding on schedule. He stared at that response for a long time. Then he did something that most of his colleagues considered very strange for a diplomat of his rank and experience. He requested a personal meeting with Director Vasquez. The meeting between Ambassador Kethala and Director Vasquez took place in neutral space, aboard a station called Midpoint that technically belonged to no one because no one had ever bothered to claim it. It was a small, slightly battered facility operated by a species called the Veth, who made their living providing neutral ground for conversations that neither party wanted recorded in official histories. The Veth charged significant fees for this service and were very good at looking like they were not listening. Kethala arrived with 2 aides and no military escort, which was either a sign of genuine good faith or a signal that he understood a military escort would accomplish nothing. Vasquez arrived alone, carrying a thermos of coffee, which Kethala had read about in his research and which struck him now, watching her pour a cup before she even sat down, as the most human thing he had ever witnessed in person. They talked for 4 hours. Most of what was said remained between them. What Kethala reported back to the council afterward was brief and carefully selected. He told them that Vasquez had been cooperative, that humanity had no aggressive intentions, and that the situation was more complex than the initial assessment had suggested. What he did not tell them was the part that had stayed with him through the entire journey home. Midway through the meeting, he had asked her directly, not diplomatically, not through carefully constructed language, but plainly, why they had not simply complied, slowed the expansion, filed the right forms, given the council what it needed to reduce the political pressure that had led to the vote. Vasquez had looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite categorize and said, "Because we knew how that story ended." She didn't mean for humanity. She pointed at the star map on the wall of the meeting room, at all the small marks that represented fringe species, the Myrith, the Talindi, the Krev, all the others. For them, she said. They complied. For 1,000 years they complied. And the council still never gave them a seat. Kethala had not answered. He had looked at the map for a while and then changed the subject, because there was no good answer, and he was a diplomat, and changing the subject was what diplomats did when the truth was inconvenient. But the word stayed with him. They were still with him 3 weeks later when the council received the first formal communication from something calling itself the Fringe Assembly. The Fringe Assembly had no headquarters. It had no flag, no military, and no formally elected leadership. What it had was a shared communication network, a set of mutually agreed trade principles, and 46 member species, all of them from regions the Galactic Council had consistently classified as low priority. The founding document of the Fringe Assembly was not written in any of the Council's recognized official languages. It was written in Human Standard, with sections translated into 12 other fringe languages, and it said, among other things, that every species had the inherent right to determine its own economic relationships, and that no governing body had the authority to restrict trade between willing partners in unregulated space. It did not mention the Galactic Council by name. It did not need to. The Council received the document and spent 2 days debating what category of political event it represented. In the end, they classified it as a regional trade organization with no formal authority and issued a statement noting that the Council respected the rights of all species to form commercial associations provided those associations remained compliant with Council interstellar law. The Fringe Assembly's response to this statement was a single line that was immediately distributed across every communication channel in the neighborhood. "We appreciate the Council's input." That was it. No argument. No counter-declaration. Just that one polite, deeply unhelpful sentence. On human stations across the Fringe, people reportedly laughed for a very long time when they read it. The Myrith captain who had brought the first cargo to Helix 7 months earlier had it embroidered onto a piece of fabric she hung above her navigation console. She said it was the most satisfying thing she had read in 40 years of operating in Council space. The Council's military advisors began pushing, around this time, for a demonstration of force, not an attack. Even the hardliners understood that open military action against humanity would be catastrophic and would turn what was currently a manageable political problem into a full-scale crisis. But a presence. Ships near the boundary of unregulated space. Something that reminded everyone in the Fringe Assembly what the Council was capable of when it chose to apply pressure in more direct ways. The proposal was debated seriously for several weeks. Kethala argued against it. He said that a military presence near the Fringe would not intimidate humanity and would not frighten the Assembly members. It would confirm every story those species had ever told each other about why the Council was not their friend. He said that the Council was facing a legitimacy problem, not a power problem, and that more power applied to a legitimacy problem made the legitimacy problem worse. He was overruled. 7 Council warships were dispatched to patrol the outer edges of regulated space as a visible reminder of Council authority. Admiral Torres tracked the ships from the moment they left their ports. He had anticipated this move and had prepared for it in the same way humanity prepared for most things. Not by building a matching force, because that was not a game they could win yet, but by making the situation more complicated than a military response could address. By the time the 7 warships reached their patrol positions, Torres had already quietly facilitated the relocation of 3 Myrith mining platforms deeper into unregulated space, moved 2 human deep space construction crews to begin work on a new communications relay that would eliminate the Fringe Assembly's last dependency on any Council-controlled signal infrastructure, and arranged for a very public joint emergency medical response. Human doctors and Telendi physicians working together to a disease outbreak on a small moon that happened to be located extremely close to the patrol zone. Warships were not well suited to preventing doctors from treating sick people. The Council patrol commanders filed confused reports. Their political superiors filed equally confused responses. No one issued any orders that made sense because no one had a model for this particular problem. The crisis on the small moon, a place called Pel's Eighth, became the moment that many later historians would identify as the true turning point, not because of what happened there militarily, since nothing did, but because of what was broadcast from there. A Krev journalist named Ussel, who had been covering the Fringe Assembly since its founding, happened to be on Pel's Eighth when the outbreak began. She recorded everything. She recorded the human medical team arriving within 18 hours of the first distress call. She recorded the Telendi physicians who came 6 hours after that. She recorded a human doctor named Reyes sitting with a sick Krev child, not because it was her job in that moment, but because the child was scared and someone needed to sit there. The footage spread across every channel in the neighborhood and then, through networks the Council did not control and could not block, into species populations all across regulated space. The Council's Public Relations Office released a statement saying that the Council had been aware of the outbreak and was coordinating a response. This was not true, and the timing made it obvious it was not true, and the species populations who received the statement compared it against the footage of Dr. Reyes sitting with the sick child and made their own conclusions. For the first time, Council member species began asking uncomfortable questions of their own governments about the vote that had outlawed humanity. They did not frame it as a political question. They framed it as a simpler one. The species that showed up to sit with a sick child. Was that really the species that needed to be outlawed? Kethala watched his communication queue fill with inquiries from Council member worlds that had never before expressed any opinion about humanity and understood, with a clarity that arrived quietly and completely, that the thing he had feared for months had now happened. The Council had not lost a battle. It had not been threatened or outmaneuvered in any military sense. It had simply, in front of everyone, looked like the wrong side of something. and in politics, across every species and every civilization he had ever studied. That was the one thing that was nearly impossible to come back from. The Galactic Council had existed for 4,000 years. It had survived wars, economic collapses, the extinction of 3 member species, 2 internal schisms, and a period known in its own records as the Long Silence, during which interstellar communication had failed for 60 years and every world had been essentially alone. It had outlasted empires. It had absorbed crises that would have shattered lesser institutions. The species who sat in its chamber believed, with the deep and largely unexamined confidence of the very old and very powerful, that they would outlast this too. That belief lasted until the morning of the 14th month, when the Dravani withdrew from the council. The Dravani were not a fringe species. They were not small or easily dismissed. They had been among the founding members of the council, present at its creation, signatories to its original charter. They maintained the second-largest trading fleet in regulated space. When the Dravani spoke in the council chamber, other species listened. When the Dravani Trade Council released its withdrawal statement, every political analyst in regulated space read it 3 times to make sure they had understood it correctly. The statement was long and carefully worded, but its central argument was simple. The decision to outlaw humanity had been presented as a security measure and had turned out to be something else entirely. It had been, the statement said, an act of institutional fear directed at a species whose primary offense was growing faster than the council was comfortable with. The Dravani could no longer participate in governance shaped by that kind of fear. They did not wish humanity ill. They did not wish the council ill. They simply declined to continue. They closed their council offices, recalled their ambassador, and sent a formal trade delegation to Director Vasquez within the week. The Dravani withdrawal was what broke the chamber's composure. Every species in the council had private anxieties they had been managing since the Pell's 8th footage and the questions from their home populations. The Dravani leaving made it impossible to manage those anxieties privately anymore. Emergency sessions were called. Procedural arguments that would normally have taken months were compressed into days. And through all of it, humanity did nothing provocative. No statement of victory. No public demands. No political maneuvering in the traditional sense. The Fringe Assembly continued operating quietly, growing steadily, welcoming new members who arrived not through any great dramatic recruitment, but simply because word had spread that it was a place that worked. Director Vasquez gave one recorded interview during this period to a journalist from a mid-rim species that had been a council member for 2,000 years. The journalist asked her what humanity wanted. Vasquez said they wanted what they had always wanted, to go places, to meet people, to build things, and to help when they could. The journalist asked if they wanted a seat on the council. Vasquez smiled and said that they would consider any invitation respectfully, but that she thought the more important question was what kind of governance the galaxy actually needed, and whether the current council was built to provide it. That interview was watched by an estimated 4 billion beings across 80 species, including every member of the Galactic Council's executive chamber. The line about governance was the one that cut deepest because it did not say the council was wrong or corrupt or evil. It said something more uncomfortable, that it might simply be outdated. An institution built for a galaxy that no longer existed, maintaining rules designed to manage a balance of power that had already shifted beneath its feet while it was looking somewhere else. The council had spent 14 months trying to diminish humanity. What humanity had done in those 14 months was prove, to every species watching, that diminishment was no longer possible. Cathala submitted his resignation from the Council Diplomatic Corps 9 days after the Dravani withdrawal. He did not make a public statement. He wrote a private letter to the Council's senior chamber that was later leaked and became one of the most widely read political documents of the decade. He wrote that he had spent 20 years studying humans and had made the mistake, for most of that time, of trying to understand them through the lens of every other species he had ever encountered. He had been looking for strategy where there was something else. He had been looking for calculation where there was genuine belief. Humans did not build the neighborhood because it would outmaneuver the council. They built it because they believed, as a fundamental matter of how they understood the universe, that everyone deserved a neighbor. He wrote that this was either the most dangerous idea he had ever encountered or the most important one, and that after 14 months of watching what it produced, he was no longer certain there was a difference. The formal diplomatic overtures began in the 15th month. Not from the Council's executive chamber. It was too soon for that, and pride moved more slowly than fear. They came first from individual member worlds, quiet bilateral conversations opened through unofficial channels, exploratory and careful, and conducted with the particular delicacy of people who needed to discuss terms without publicly admitting they were discussing terms. Vasquez handled each one personally, or delegated them to people she trusted absolutely. There were no triumphant press releases. There were no demands for apology or acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just conversations. About trade. About medicine. About the relay stations humanity had built and whether certain council worlds might connect to them. About the research that human scientists had been doing in the fringe, in genetics and materials science and deep space agriculture, and whether anyone might want to share notes. What emerged from those conversations, over the following year, was not a new treaty or a restructured council. It was something harder to name, a slow reweaving of relationships across regulated and unregulated space, built not on legal documents, but on accumulated trust. Some council worlds never fully reconciled. A few doubled down, maintained the formal language of the decree, and simply watched as their economic and political relevance quietly diminished. The council itself neither collapsed nor transformed dramatically. It shrank, not in any official sense, but in the sense that mattered, the sense of how much weight its voice carried when it spoke, how many species automatically looked to it for direction, how large a portion of galactic affairs passed through its structures. The center of gravity had moved. Everyone felt it. No one could point to the exact moment it happened. On a station in the outer fringe, almost 2 years after the decree, Admiral Torres stood at an observation window and watched a fleet of ships depart for their various destinations. Human freighters, Myrith cargo haulers, a new Talenti long-range research vessel, 2 ships belonging to species whose names most people in regulated space still could not pronounce. They were not a military formation. They were not a demonstration. They were just traffic. Normal, daily, unremarkable traffic on routes that had not existed 2 years ago, serving relationships that had not existed 2 years ago, in a part of the galaxy that the Council had never bothered to imagine could be important. Torres thought about the word they had used, outlawed, and how much weight it had seemed to carry when the decree was announced, and how little it weighed now. A law only had the power its enforcement gave it. An institution only had the authority others granted it. The Council had tried to use its law to make humanity smaller. All they had actually done was draw a line. And humanity, true to form, had looked at that line and thought about what was on the other side of it. Director Vasquez was on New Carthage the day the Council issued its revised statement. Not a repeal of the decree, which would have required admitting the decree had been a mistake, but a suspension pending review, which was the same thing dressed in different language. She was in the same cafeteria where she had received the original decree 2 years earlier. She read the statement once, set her calm down, picked up her coffee. Outside the window, the colony was in full morning activity. Cargo lifts, children going to school, engineers heading toward the spaceport, a group of Myrith traders who had settled on New Carthage 3 months ago laughing with a cluster of human dock workers over something that Vasquez was too far away to hear. She watched them for a while and thought that this was the thing no one who had voted for the decree had ever really understood. You could not outlaw a species that had made itself, quietly and deliberately, and without drama, completely necessary to the people around it. You could try. You could write the decree and cast the vote, and send the warships to the edge of regulated space. But somewhere in the fringe, a doctor would sit with a sick child, and a cargo ship would arrive with medicine, and a station would be built where there had been nothing, and that was always going to matter more than the vote. It was always going to win. Not because humanity was powerful, because they showed up. They kept showing up. And in the end, that was the one thing in the galaxy that no law had ever successfully made illegal.